A flight from Sydney to Perth, a journey within the same country, can sometimes cost more than flying from Sydney to Singapore, a different continent entirely. This isn't a rare glitch, it's a common reality of flying in Australia. The immediate reaction is to blame the airlines for simple price gouging. But what if the real reason isn't corporate greed, but something written into the very geography of the Australian continent? What if the high price of a ticket is a symptom of a much larger, more complex story about distance, emptiness, and the brutal economics of keeping a continent connected? The simple explanation of overcharging is tempting, but it's often wrong. The truth is far more interesting. On the surface, the problem looks simple. For decades, Australia's domestic aviation market has been dominated by a handful of major players. When you see a ticket price that defies logic, the easiest and most intuitive explanation is that you're looking at a classic duopoly in action. The airlines, with few real competitors on many routes, are simply charging what the market will bear. And to be clear, competition is a powerful force. Government reports and passenger experiences confirm it. When a new, aggressive, low-cost airline enters a popular route, prices can tumble dramatically. The presence of a third or fourth player forces everyone to be more competitive. But this is where the simple explanation starts to break down. It explains price fluctuations, but it doesn't explain the persistently high floor. Why is the fundamental cost of moving a person from one side of the continent to the other so high to begin with? If it were purely a matter of corporate greed, a new, efficient airline could theoretically enter the market, undercut the giants, and capture a massive audience. Yet, the history of Australian aviation is littered with the bankruptcies of ambitious airlines that tried to do just that. They came, they competed, and they failed. This suggests the problem is deeper than the behavior of a few companies. It points to a structural issue, something baked into the very system. The real question isn't just, why are airlines charging so much? But rather, what makes running an airline in Australia so uniquely and brutally expensive? Why can you fly across a dozen European countries for the price of a single domestic Australian flight of the same distance? The answer isn't a conspiracy. It's economics, shaped by geography. To understand this puzzle, we have to stop looking at airline price charts and start looking at a map. But not in the way you think. The key isn't just how far apart the cities are, but the vast, silent emptiness that lies between them. That emptiness is the beginning of our answer. To understand the cost, you have to understand the shape of the country. Take the landmass of Australia and lay it over a map of the United States. It fits, almost perfectly. Now do the same with Europe. It stretches from Portugal to Ukraine. The distances are continental, but the crucial difference is what fills that space. In Europe or the US, that map is a dense web of cities, towns, and infrastructure. In Australia, it's an ocean of red dust. Australia isn't a country of connected cities. It's a nation of population islands, clustered on the coasts, separated by a vast, economically hostile void. Over 90% of the population lives in that thin coastal strip. This geography creates a unique problem for aviation, the tyranny of thin routes. A thin route is an airline industry term for a flight path that connects two points, but has relatively low or inconsistent passenger demand. The flight from Sydney to Perth is a perfect example. It's a 5-hour journey, comparable to flying from New York to Los Angeles. But the New York and Los Angeles metropolitan areas have a combined population of over 30 million people, creating a deep, constant, and predictable flow of travelers. The Sydney and Perth metro areas combined have less than a third of that. This is the brutal arithmetic of aviation. The cost of flying a modern jet across a continent, the fuel, the crew, the maintenance, is enormous, and it's largely fixed. Whether the plane is full or half empty, the cost to the airline is almost the same. On a dense route like London to Paris, that massive cost is spread across hundreds of thousands of passengers a week. On a thin Australian route, the same fixed cost must be divided among far fewer people, which inevitably pushes the price per ticket up for everyone. It's not just about distance. It's about the number of wallets available to pay for crossing it. So the distances are huge, and there are fewer passengers to share the cost. But a modern aircraft is an efficient machine. Surely, flying a half-empty plane is better than not flying it at all. This seems logical, but it overlooks a crucial fact. A huge portion of an airline's cost is locked in before the plane's wheels even leave the tarmac. And in Australia, those ground costs are uniquely high. That cost on the ground is where the economics of Australian aviation get truly punishing. Before an airline can even begin to think about profit, it has to pay a series of massive, largely fixed fees. Think of it as the invisible portion of your ticket price. For every single flight, there are landing and parking charges at the airport. There are fees for using the nation's air traffic control system. There are mandatory security screening costs. These are not small numbers, and they are charged per aircraft movement, not per passenger. So on a flight with 180 seats, these costs are divided by 180. On a regional flight with 70 seats, they're divided by 70. The per-person share of the burden automatically goes up. But the single biggest ground-based factor is the logistical nightmare of jet fuel. Australia is a continent-sized country with only a handful of oil refineries. Getting fuel to a major coastal hub like Sydney or Melbourne is relatively straightforward, but getting that same jet fuel to a remote airport in the heart of the country is a different story. It might arrive by ship, be transferred to a train, and then travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers by road tanker. Every step in that supply chain adds a significant cost premium. Fuel at a remote regional airport can be substantially more expensive than at a capital city airport. Not because of a global oil crisis, but because of the sheer diesel-burning effort it took to get it there. When you combine these high, non-negotiable ground costs with the thin passenger demand we saw earlier, the math becomes inescapable. The fundamental cost of just getting a plane into the air from a regional Australian town is already incredibly high. Spreading that cost over a small number of travelers mathematically guarantees an expensive seat. The airline isn't starting its pricing from zero. It's starting from a deep financial hole it has to climb out of on every single flight. We've now established a high-cost floor, but this still doesn't explain everything. If high costs were the only factor, why is the 90-minute flight between Sydney and Melbourne, one of the busiest air routes in the world, often one of the cheapest in the country per kilometer? Yet a 90-minute flight to a small regional town can cost 3 or 4 times as much. The costs are high everywhere. So what's the final, powerful variable that determines the price you actually pay? The answer lies in what happens when you're the only ride in town. This is where competition, or the lack of it, becomes the final, decisive factor that separates a reasonable fare from a shocking one. Let's return to that flight between Sydney and Melbourne. It's part of what's known as the Golden Triangle, the routes connecting Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. This small corner of the continent accounts for a massive share of all domestic air travel. Because of this density, it's a brutal competitive battlefield. Multiple airlines, including major carriers and their low-cost offshoots, are all fighting for the same massive pool of business and leisure travelers. On this corridor, the laws of supply and demand work exactly as you'd expect. Intense competition forces prices down. Now, contrast that with a flight from a capital city to a regional mining town or a remote community. The high ground costs and fuel logistics are still there, perhaps even more so. But suddenly, the competition vanishes. Often, only one airline services that route, and if there are two, they may not fly at convenient times. This creates a de facto monopoly. When you are the only option, the entire pricing equation changes. The price is no longer dictated by a battle to be the cheapest. Instead, it's determined by what the market can bear. The passengers, be they local residents, fly-in, fly-out workers, or government employees, have no other choice. Driving might take 2 days, and a train line may not even exist. The effect is not subtle. Australia's own Competition and Consumer Commission has repeatedly found that fares on routes with more competitors are substantially lower. On some routes, the entry of a single new airline has been shown to cause prices to fall significantly. The airline on that lonely regional route isn't necessarily breaking any rules. It's simply responding to the economic reality of being the only ride in town. They are pricing their service based on the value it provides in a market with no alternatives. So, We have a continent defined by vast distance, a population too sparse to create high demand, a cost structure bloated by logistics, and market dynamics that punish anyone living outside the three major cities. It sounds like a broken system.
But what if it's not broken? What if this is the only way the system can work at all?
To understand that, we need to ask one final question. What is an airline in Australia for? This brings us to the final and perhaps most important piece of the puzzle. When you combine the tyranny of distance, the emptiness between cities, the punishing ground costs, and the monopoly-like power on thin routes, you arrive at a fundamental truth. In a dense continent like Europe, aviation is often a consumer choice, a convenience, a form of luxury. In Australia, it is infrastructure. These flight paths aren't just lines on a map. They are the steel and pavement of invisible highways. They are the bridges spanning an ocean of desert. They are the economic lifelines that allow a mining town in the Pilbara to exist. They are the threads that enable a doctor from Sydney to reach a remote community in the Northern Territory. They are the connective tissue that holds a continent-sized nation together. The fly-in, fly-out economy, a pillar of Australia's wealth, would collapse without them. And here lies the central dilemma. We are asking private, for-profit companies to provide a public utility in one of the world's most challenging operating environments. The high ticket price is a direct, unfiltered reflection of that reality. It is the market's way of funding an essential service that, in other countries, might be accomplished with a sprawling network of government-funded highways and high-speed rail. The consequences of this are profound. It creates a quiet but persistent barrier between the major cities and the rest of the nation, making it more expensive to do business, visit family, or explore one's own country. It puts a brake on regional tourism and adds a heavy financial burden to the lives of Australians who live outside the bustling eastern corridor. Could new aircraft technology, different models of government partnership, or one day even hyper-efficient ground transport begin to alter this fundamental equation? Perhaps. But for now, the reality is written in the landscape itself. The high price of an Australian flight is not a sign that the system is broken. It is the receipt for a monumental task. It is the price of defying geography. It is the cost of connecting a continent.